Okay, so this is the fifth of a six-lecture series on the life and thought of Baruch Spinoza by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. So I want to begin today by looking at just reviewing something that came as a result of a question by some questions by Stephen that he'd written me between last class, because I want to kind of make something clear. If I may not have been as clear as I would like to be. Spinoza lived at a time of a transition in worldviews. This transition had begun with the Copernican theories publication. It lasted through the 16th and 17th century, and even though we're talking about the last half of the 17th century, that worldview was still not fully realized, explicated, or accepted. And I think that that's a very important thing to understand. And so what I've given you here is a chart from the work of the scholar Ian Barbour, B-A-R-B-O-U-R, who just died last year at a very advanced age. Ian Barbour was one of the founders of the modern academic study of the relationship between science and religion. But he was not only an academic, he was a theologian as well, a Protestant theologian. Anyway, he wrote an incredible book in the early beginning of the early 60s called Issues in Science and Religion, which essentially he rewrote twice or three times during his life to bring it up to modern day. And part of that book began with the historical relationship of science and religion from the 16th through the 20th century. And there also have been other historians who have studied this relationship, partly to counter common ideas that somehow there's an entity called science and there's an entity called religion, which have always been in conflict with each other, which is historically completely inaccurate. But one of the things that Barbour shows here, and this is one of the last chapters of the book, is how changing views of nature, in other words, I will call them worldviews, how they do radically differ from one another, but they don't come quickly. Although the further in human history you go, the quicker things happen exponentially. So, what was the old order that the new worldview of the 16th and 17th century was overthrowing? The medieval worldview, as Ian Barbour calls it. It has a fixed order. The universe, nature, has a fixed order. Secondly, it's teleological. This is Aristotelian physics, where something falls not because there is a force acting upon it, because it is the nature of matter. Its end result, so to speak, is to be heavy and therefore to sink towards the center of the earth, if possible, right? So things have, everything has an end goal, so to speak. Substantive. Now, that means that everything is made up of sort of large-scale substances, the classic elements of air, earth, fire, and water. Okay? It's hierarchical. And if you take a look on the second page of what I gave you, there's a chart called the Great Chain of Being. This is a term that was utilized by, I forget which historian, that there is a hierarchy of being with God at the top, right? And you see as it goes down, angels, demons, man, notice women are below men, animals, plants, minerals, and the lowest stage, of course, is non-living matter. Okay? You notice it's hierarchical. It has levels. One level assumed to be superior than the other, also less material. Right? And it's anthropocentric. It puts man, and I mean man, at the top of the hierarchy of earthly creatures. Right? Now, if you take a look on the same page The Ptolemaic Worldview, which is what this was based on, is this is the fixed order with Earth at the center and shells of the planets and stars surrounding it, and you have the sun. You've got the sun is sort of in the middle there. Anything below the moon, the sublunar sphere, is in the realm of what we would call the physical. Once you go beyond the sphere of the moon, matter becomes increasingly, to use a term that isn't quite fit the way we understand it today, spiritual, less material in form. Right? Okay, so that's the fixed worldview, that's the hierarchy of it. Also, number 5, it's dualistic. There is an ontological separation between the soul and the body, between spirit and matter. That's what happens above the cycle of the moon, right? Lastly, the metaphor for this worldview is that of a kingdom. Here's another one. With God as the king, right? And the subjects, everything else is God's subjects below, in sort of, who's below the salt, who's above the salt, right? Who's closest to the king, who's furthest away from the king. That's the metaphor, okay? Stephen, I'm right in the middle of sort of answering one of your questions, which is why I emailed this chart out. Did you copy it?
No, I didn't. That was this morning?
No, it was yesterday, or 2 days ago. Anyway, so that's the order that existed prior to the Copernican revolution, that was transitioning during even, over the next 200 years, right? Don't assume that everybody all of a sudden accepted it.
Copernicus, approximately what?
1500.
1500.
Okay, let's take the, 1500.
And Ptolemy?
Oh, he's an ancient Greek, but his worldview, essentially his astronomical perspective, coupled with Aristotelian physics, was the accepted science of the day from late antiquity up until the Copernican revolution. Now, because it was so deeply accepted and had been around for more than 1,000 years, it was embedded into not only the science, what we would call the science and philosophy of the day, but the religious perspectives. This is one of the reasons why Galileo had such trouble, because he was part of that transition to this new worldview. So I cannot even say exactly when the transition from the medieval to the what is called here the Newtonian is complete. But, you had communities that continued to reject Copernicus into the 19th century. Many Orthodox Jews refused to accept because it contradicted the literalness of the Bible. And you still have, by the way, in some Orthodox circles, still struggling with that issue to this day. And in some evangelical circles, that if you take the Bible literally, then the Bible exhibits a geocentric universe. Not Ptolemy's geocentric universe, but nonetheless. So you could say this transition has not been fully achieved yet, but I would say that by the late 18th century, it had been fairly, it was the prevalent worldview, and certainly throughout the 19th century it was. So what you have next is what Barber calls the Newtonian worldview, because it's based on Newtonian physics. And again, Newton's ideas were not accepted right away by everybody. They took a while. But Newton, in effect, created the physical, the appropriate theories that backed up the Copernican worldview. In other words, Copernicus discovered nothing new. What he did was to take what was already known and rearrange it in a form that made more sense. It was people like Galileo and Kepler who actually found the evidence for what Copernicus was saying, the astronomical evidence by telescopes and mathematics and all this kind of stuff. And it was Newton who supplied the laws of nature that could explain this universe, could explain the motion of the planets.
Copernicus was a mathematician.
No, he was an astronomer, and I mean, he was all of those things.
But what was he, primarily an astronomer?
I don't know. I would say he was a natural philosopher, and that often included everything, right? But the point is that what happened is that the old Ptolemaic universe had gotten so complicated, because this is a very simplified form of it here, because there have been so many, over hundreds and hundreds of years, the observations of the planets didn't fit this this is the ideal form, didn't fit this. So they had to create things called epicycles, where cycles within cycles within cycles in order to fit the observational evidence. The whole system was becoming unmanageable. So Copernicus took all of that and said, if we put the sun at the center instead of the earth, all these problems disappear. It's what the historian of science Thomas Kuhn called the paradigm shift. He invented that term. You have one paradigm. It begins to sort of stumble under the weight of new observations until somebody comes along and says, here's a better way to look at the same evidence. That's what Copernicus did. He didn't have a telescope, remember. It was when the invention of the telescope, when Galileo started making his observations, that he could prove that Copernicus, in principle, was correct. And of course, he added huge amounts of knowledge by discovering the moons of Jupiter and all kinds of other things. And then Kepler, of course, was able, by the notion of being able to give a more mathematically accurate description of the notions of the planet, which was assumed before that they went in perfect circles, which they don't. They go in ellipses, right? But the problem for many people at the time is that the Newtonian, the Aristotelian laws of physics would not allow for what they were observing. So it was when Newton came along and was able to, through gravity, the laws of gravity and thermodynamics, he was in effect able to give them the physics that matched the evidence. But again, it wasn't accepted by everybody right away. And of course, there were a lot of other people involved as well. It's not just three people. It was a large number of people who were adding to this body of knowledge. And by the way, this changeover was not just happening in astronomy. It was happening in mathematics. It was happening beginning to happen in biology, especially in the 17th century. And the Newtonian worldview was radically different from the medieval. First of all, change as rearrangement. In other words, if you take a look down to number 3, it's an atomistic view that everything is made up of particles that are constantly changing and moving and rearranging themselves. There is no fixed order in the way it was understood. Change is part of that order, but it's not disordered change. The laws are no longer teleological, but deterministic. Namely, that you can, if you know the right right way to describe something, you can predict. Well, first of all, you can describe how it got to be where it did, and the same law allows you to predict what's going to happen to it in the future. In other words, the laws of motion allow you in Newtonian physics to make a prediction. The typical one people use are billiard balls, right? But I mean, Galileo was part of this as well. That when you roll a ball down an inclined plane, if you know the incline and so on and so forth, you can mathematically predict where that ball is going to go, right? Or the speed or various things of that sort. So it's deterministic. In theory, having been able to describe past motion and action, in theory, you can perfectly predict where everything will go, assuming you have enough knowledge. This got to the point in the 19th century where one French scientist essentially believed that if you knew the position of every particle at any particular time, you could perfectly predict what would happen in the future. right? And he knew that, practically speaking, that was impossible, but in principle, he felt it was possible. Okay? So the fourth thing that you gets out of the Newtonian worldview is that it's reductionist. Namely, everything can be explained by its smallest parts. Right? If you know the laws of physics and chemistry, they are the lowest level, so to speak, everything can be explained that way. And by reducing everything, that's where you get reductionist, to its lowest common denominator, you can then understand it. Right? You take apart an animal by dissection and know its parts. The parts will explain the whole. Newtonian worldview is interesting as it continues this dualistic idea, but it's no longer between the spirit and matter, but the mind and the body. This is Descartes, right? That the mind is a separate entity, radically separated, although connected from the body. All right? I think, therefore I am. The I is I think. That is the true I, not the body. This is a kind of, another way of expressing fairly similar perspective that, excuse me one second, that was being expressed in the old medieval view. You just have to excuse me. I'm beginning to have a migraine, and I have a pill for that. I rarely get migraines, but I'm prepared when I do.
It's reductionistic, isn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, to go on. The metaphor for the Newtonian worldview is the machine. The universe is a machine. The body is a machine. Everything is a machine because a machine is made up of distinct parts, right? You can take it apart and put it back together again. And by taking it apart, you understand how it works. Now, the machine metaphor is one that we still have with us. What's interesting is some of this stuff is still with us to this day. Reductionism is still used in science. It was one of the methodologies that has helped us produce the technology we have. The discovery of the genetic code is the ultimate act of biological reductionism. When people discuss human behavior in terms of genes and other things like that, that's a reductionist idea that a human is a machine and coded by the genes, and all you need to know, if you know all the meaning of the parts, you'll understand the whole, right? And in fact, the development of the computer was in effect also from this reductionist paradigm because they were attempting to create something that mimicked the brain. And they thought they understood on a reductionist level how the brain worked. So they created a machine to replicate that. And now the computer metaphor is the latest iteration of the machine metaphor. Think of how many computer terms have crept into everyday speech to describe human behavior. Right? So the machine metaphor is one that is extremely powerful and is still with us. So in many ways, there's a large part, we are still in many ways on a day-to-day basis in this, culturally, in this Newtonian worldview. Yes, Stephen?
About mind and body, are they saying that understanding all the chemistry and biology and everything doesn't explain the mind?
Yeah, in other words, that was the thing that they left out, right? This is where the idea that there is some kind of soul, some kind of mind that is not part of the material, entity, right? It's connected to, but not essentially part of.
My other question is, did Newton's theology keep up with his science.
Yeah, well, in fact, Newton himself was a kind of transitional figure because he was also an alchemist.
Right.
So,
but he also studied the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, he was that's the point. Most of these scientists, Spinoza was in some ways unique to this, was in their own way a deeply religious people. In other words, this is not, again, there isn't this split, right? Even Spinoza, who didn't do any new scientific discoveries, but was certainly part of that community, was nonetheless in his own way a deeply religious person, right? Okay, so now what Barber calls the 20th century worldview, we might call it the Einsteinian worldview. Einstein, of course, by the theories of relativity, doesn't overthrow, but in some ways replaces, on a certain level, the whole of Newtonian physics. Newtonian physics is now seen within the revolution of physics that really started with the physicists of the earliest 20th century, like Einstein and Bohr and Heisenberg and all these others, okay? And this is also where Darwin's theory of evolution begins to have an impact, where we understand that the order of the universe is neither fixed nor some kind of rearrangement, because again, even Spinoza believed, even though he believed in a heliocentric universe, it was still a fairly fixed eternal order. Like if you look at page 3, this is the earliest diagram of the Copernican universe done by an Englishman in the late 16th century. This is the worldview of Copernicus. It's still a kind of fixed order, but with just the sun at the center, right? Once you begin to realize that we're just part of a galaxy, and galaxies are, billions of galaxies, then that's completely changing everything even from Copernicus's day, right? So one of the things that we now understand is that things are evolutionary. The whole universe is in a form of evolution. Everything is changing constantly. There is no fixed order in the way we understand it. Therefore, the history of something is important. The history of life, the geological history of the earth, the cosmological history of the universe. In other words, this historical consciousness, which, by the way, began to really enter human cultural ideas, the study of history, the way we know it, started a couple hundred years before this, right? Where in the Jewish community, for example, in the 19th century, you begin to see analyzing the Judaism as a historical phenomenon. This starts in Germany in the first quarter of the 19th century with a group called the Wissenschaft des Judentum, the science of Judaism, right? Where you study the historical evolution of the prayer book, or ultimately the Bible, right? So this historical perspective is central to this post-Newtonian worldview. Yes, Stephen?
Didn't the Greeks and the guy who talked about the Roman era, Josephus?
They had a history, but not the way not modern history. Okay, I'm talking about modern historical understanding.
Explain what
Well, they were more in the realm of what we would call chronology. And although, yes, history has its roots in Thucydides and some of the Greek historians and Roman historians, nonetheless, the way we understand history as attempting to be an objective critical analysis did not exist back then. Okay? The other thing that comes out is that things are emergent. Things emerge out of things that come before in a way that isn't necessarily one is able to predict. Right? We'll get a little more out of that. Now, instead of everything being deterministic, and by the way, a lot of scientists still believe in the deterministic paradigm, we understand that there is a dance, as it were, between physical laws and chance or contingency, that there is actual randomness in the system. So yes, there are sort of, here are the laws of physics, right? Between these boundaries, there's a room for a certain amount of randomness. Okay? This is where, by the way, the whole science of chaos started emerging in the 60s. The study of chaos or fractals, if you've heard of them. All these kinds of things. It started, by the way, with weather prediction, where it was discovered that, you know, weather is an inherently chaotic system, where even if you know every piece of information, because the initial small changes in initial conditions, the further you go down, the more it will be less and less predictable. So you should understand that any weather predictions past 3 days are really not worth anything. Okay? And even if they had a measuring thing every square yard of the entire planet, that would be the case. So this is part of this what's called chaos theory, or complex. Now it's often referred to as complexity theory. The more complex a system is, while it still works within certain physical constraints by the laws of physics, within those constraints there is an incredible room for variation. Okay? Now, therefore, what you have is something that's a little less atomistic. It's relational, ecological, interdependent. We understand how systems interact, right? You may not, it's for example in the science of ecology, from a kind of reductionist perspective, a particular species may seem unimportant, but within an ecological context, if that species goes exist, it triggers a cascade of changes in the system. Okay? So there's a sense of interdependence, relational, what we call an ecological perspective on things. And therefore, instead of reductionism, you're looking more at systems and wholes, organistic, a holistic perspective, rather than reductionist. Again, it doesn't mean that reductionism doesn't work, but it doesn't fully describe what's going on. Even if you know the laws of physics and chemistry, you cannot necessarily, with 100% certainty, predict where the system will go. Right? You know that there are limits to the change, but within those limits, you can't necessarily predict it.
In a sense, this is an appreciation for the complexity. That things are much more complex than we realize. Then it's easy. You can't calculate it because it's just too complex.
You can calculate it, but again, past a certain point, certain kinds of systems you will not be able to accurately predict. You can that's, by the way, why statistics become important. Because you can give a statistical probabilities, right?
But even then they have a margin of error.
Yes, exactly. And it's easier, again, probability depends on scale. The larger the scale, the easier it is to predict, right? The smaller the scale, the more uncertainties fall into the system, the less predictability. Yes?
With higher mathematics, you can't basically predict.
Yes, that was Gödel. The mathematician Gödel, in effect, says that math, by very principle, will never be able to fully capture what's, what can be. There will always be something else. And so instead of this dualism, you have multi-levels, right? You start with physics and chemistry, but then you move up a level, right? And every time you move up a level, you cannot necessarily predict the next level of complexity by the lowest level. If you understand what I mean by that? In other words, the mind is an emergent quality of the brain. Now, there are many neuroscientists will say the mind is the brain, but there are others who will say that the mind is somehow an emergent quality of the brain. Okay? And the brain, the physical things that we know of the brain, and what people know of the brain gets increasingly better, but also increasingly complex, doesn't necessarily fully... This is where the big reductionist arguments these days are going on in neuroscience. Okay? And the metaphor now is no longer a machine. but Barber says is a community. There are other people who've used other metaphors in their own particular perspectives. There's an architect named Jason McLennan who has said that classical architecture is based upon the metaphor that the building is a machine. It pulls in its energy and things that it needs, and it spews out waste, right? He has tried to create a new metaphor for what he calls the living building that in effect would be part of the ecosystem of where it is built. Namely, it would generate all its own power and its water and treat all its own waste. So there would be nothing that would have to go in and nothing that would have to go out. And his new metaphor is, for a building, is a flower. Because a flower takes in sunlight, takes in all it needs in terms of water from the rain, and is aesthetically beautiful. For an architect, obviously, that's important. Okay? Yes?
Is that the same as sustainability?
Sustainability is part of this new metaphor, right? Okay, so that's been a long kind of way, but I think it helps you put Spinoza in his understanding of what was going on in his day. In his day, there was the transition between the medieval and the Newtonian. Okay? And he is part of that transition. But it is not complete. And of course, in transition, there are always fights that are going on. And these transitions, by the way, have political implications. Right? It's not just science. It's about politics. It's about the nature of society. It's the way humans are viewed. So all of these things are part and parcel of what is going on. So let's take a look at, as I said, at chapter 6 on miracles. We're not going to look at the whole chapter, but we're going to look at parts of it because I think that this is a very critical point in terms of what he believes about the natural world and therefore about what happens when you have something that seems to go above it. Now, remember, even Newtonian-like scientists who believed in pretty deterministic laws of the natural world believed that God had the free will ability, if God wanted to usurp those laws for particular purposes. For Christians, this was critically important in terms of the incarnation of Jesus, the incarnation of God in a body, and the resurrection of Jesus, which are obviously supernatural. They are not part of natural law, but they are essential for the Christian community. So there were Christian scientists or natural philosophers who believed that God could intervene in the natural world, although did so very rarely. Right? In the Jewish world, that was essentially Maimonides' perspective. That the laws of nature are the things that commonly rule. God could intervene, but does not intervene. And what we perceive as miracles in the biblical stories are, first of all, either visions, such as the talking ass of Balaam was not real, it was a vision of Balaam, or it was built into the universe from the beginning to occur at that particular moment. There is a rabbinic midrash in Pirkei Avot that says 10 things were created before the sixth day of creation, and list a number of biblical miracles, which in effect means they were built into the natural order, but to occur once at a particular time, like a cuckoo clock. That's how Maimonides explained some of the biblical miracles, right? Because people like Maimonides, Aristotelians, wanted to preserve natural law from any disruption whatsoever. You see it a certain amount in Rabbinic Judaism, by the way. I mean, that's where this midrash comes out of, so to speak. But the rabbis did believe in miracles, and obviously they believed in supernatural stuff. But so this is what Spinoza's reacting against.
So Maimonides believed in preserving natural law, except he believed in preserving what was scriptural,
Yes.
even more than preserving natural law.
Well,
this is the way he could align the two.
He could align the two. So, I mean, I gave you in my email yesterday a quote from the Encyclopedia Judaica, which described the views of miracles in Maimonides' and others, Yehuda Halevi, people who believed that God had the power to circumvent the laws of nature and could whenever God wanted. Maimonides wanted to limit that severely. Okay? I mean, the biggest problem that he had in terms of that is also the resurrection of the dead in the days of the Messiah, the most supremely unnatural thing. Okay, so let's get into the chapter. Stephen, do you want to start?
Just as men habitually call
This is on page 81, by the way.
Call that knowledge which surpasses human understanding divinity.
That's prophetic, right? Prophetic inspiration.
So they likewise classify any phenomenon whose cause is unknown by the common people divine or a work of God. For the common people imagine that the power and providence of God are most clearly evident when they see something happen contrary to the usual course of things, and their habitual views about nature, especially should it turn out to their benefit or advantage. They also suppose the existence of God is proven by nothing more clearly than from what they perceive as nature failing to follow its normal course. For this reason, they suppose that all those who explain or attempt to explain phenomenon and miracles by natural causes are doing away with God, or at least divine providence.
Now, this is a very important point, right? That people see things they don't understand, they cannot explain. Therefore, they call it a miracle. It is a God circumventing the laws of nature that God set out, okay? And that this for them is the biggest proof of the providence of God. Providence meaning the way God acts in the world, what we often call divine action, right? Because you see a supernatural event, this helps you to believe in divine action in the world, because if you're just looking at the regular course of things, you don't necessarily see it. And therefore, he says, those who want to do away with this idea of miracles are claimed to be people who are doing away with God entirely, therefore they're called atheists, or they are saying that God does not act in the world. There is no divine providence. So he's facing his critics. And to this very day, by the way, there are people who believe that if you believe that there is randomness in the universe, then you cannot believe in divine providence. Because if there is divine providence, there is no randomness. That everything must be an act of God if God is all-powerful. That God caused me to do that, rather than I just happened to think, I felt like picking that up. Right? And there are no accidents, therefore.
How do you know that the randomness is not an act of God?
Well, that would be another course, Sam. But the point is that the whole issue of determinism this comes down to determinism versus free will, for example. So the modern debate is, if amongst those who are fixed on both sides, is if you believe in complete determinism, then there can be no free will. If you believe in free will, then not everything is determined. You can even look at that on a non-theological basis. All right, let's read on. Keep going. They evidently hold.
They evidently hold that God is inactive whilst nature follows its normal course, and conversely that the power of nature and natural causes are superfluous whenever God is active. Hence they imagine that there are two powers distinct from each other, the power of God and the power of natural things, and that the latter is determined by God in some way, or, as most men think in our day, created by him. But what they understand by these powers and what they understand by God and nature, they certainly do not know, except that they imagine the power of God to be like the authority of royal majesty, and the power of nature to be like a force and impetus.
Now, he's being a little unfair to some people at the time who believe that God is constantly creating. The notion of ongoing creation did exist in certain theological circles. But it's interesting. What he's referring to here is what's called primary and secondary causes, that God works through the natural law by setting up the natural law. God is the primary cause, but natural law therefore produces secondary causes that may not necessarily be the direct action of God. But notice again, he's using the medieval. He describes this in the as the medieval metaphor of a king. Correct. So he's claiming again. I think he's being a little unfair here, that you are in effect setting up two powers. Even if the laws of nature come from God, nature seems to be acting on its own, completely sort of divorced from God, and then God decides at certain points to intervene into that normal course of events. Yes,
On the
Paul.
seventh day, when he rested and said there's a perfect world, you don't believe that.
What? No, well, I mean, that's, I'm talking about what he says.
Yeah, but he doesn't believe that it's a perfect world on the seventh day.
I have no idea. I don't know what he thinks about those things, I'll be perfectly honest with you. All right. Suzanne, why don't you pick it up?
The common people, therefore, call unusual works of nature miracles or works of God, and do not want to know the natural causes of things, partly from devotion and partly from zeal to oppose those who pursue natural philosophy.
In other words, natural philosophy, i.e. science, is seeking to understand the cause of everything within physical laws, right? Trying to do away with the category of the supernatural. Go on.
They desire only to hear about that of which they are most ignorant, and consequently about which they marvel most. Evidently, this is because they can only adore God and ascribe all things to his will and governance by ignoring natural causes and evincing wonder at what is outside the normal course of nature, and revere the power of God best when they envisage the power of nature as if it were subdued by God.
Okay, I want to just say one thing here. You may be wondering sometime at Spinoza's tone of attack. You have to understand, this is a rhetorical device he uses when he attacks his opponents. Not unusual in his day. He's using, don't forget, to a certain extent, this book has a certain polemical tone to it. So don't think that because of this, and this is something that Stephen asked me, that therefore he's an arrogant person. He was using rhetorical devices of his day, and relatively speaking, he was actually fairly mild compared to what critics were saying about him. Okay, and in the medieval times, by the way, polemical literature, by our terms, is much worse than anything of what politicians are saying about each other. Okay, I'm serious. These days, not much worse, but nonetheless worse. All right, read on.
This attitude seems to originate among the first Jews. They narrated miraculous stories to convince the pagans of their day, who adored visible gods like the sun, the moon, water, air, and so on, that those gods were weak and inconstant or mutable and subordinate to the invisible God. They also wanted to show that the whole of nature was directed by the governance of the God whom they adored solely for their own benefit. People have always been so drawn to this idea that to this day they have not ceased to invent miracles in order to foment the belief that they are dearer to God than others and are the ultimate reason for God's creation and continual governance of all things. What will the common people not arrogate to themselves in their foolishness? They have no sound conception of either God or nature, and confusing God's decrees with human decisions, consider nature to be so limited that they believe men are its most important part.
Notice he is going away from anthropocentrism here. Mm-hmm. I want to say one other thing that has come up. who did he write this for, right? I want to amend something I said before. He wasn't writing this for only the elite, but he did write it in Latin, remember? He was writing it for the educated masses. In other words, you have to distinguish between the uneducated masses and the educated masses. And one of the features, by the way, of Dutch society was widespread literacy. I mean, there were a lot of people who were not scientists, philosophers, clerics, who were educated, could read and write, and very often could read and write Latin as well. So this book is aimed at the educated masses because they're the ones who are going to make political change, not just a little tiny group of philosophers.
Can you really apply the word masses to this group that could read Latin?
Yes, absolutely. They were big enough within the Netherlands. There were enough, because don't forget the merchants. Trade was the essential characteristic of Dutch society in many ways.
Right.
It was an urban civilization, relatively speaking, right?
Well, what does that have to do with learning Latin? I mean,
because that was like the international language.
It was.
Oh yeah, it was the language that educated people knew. Now, I'm not saying all the merchants knew Latin, but the fact is, you could converse in writing with people in England and France and other places by using Latin, and also to be thought of as educated is to have read some of the classics. Now, they may not have gone so far as to learn Greek, but to learn Latin, of course, wasn't as difficult as a European language in the same alphabet, essentially. So there were probably a lot of merchants who read Dutch, but couldn't read Latin, and that's one of the reasons why at some point this book was translated into French and into English and to other languages, were vernaculars, but the fact is, there were enough people who were educated who could read Latin that he was trying to affect people beyond a very small circle of philosophers, unlike his other work, The Ethics.
What did Newton write in?
What?
What language did Newton write in? Do you know?
I think it was in Latin.
Yeah, that's what.
The scientific community was writing in Latin because that way they could converse with each other across, because the scientific community was transnational. So by writing in Latin, everybody could read each other's books.
Okay.
All right. So number 2, he's actually now going to get into the basic principles that govern the rest of the chapter. So Suzanne, you want to continue?
But this is quite enough about the opinions and prejudices of the common people regarding nature and miracles. We should now put this question into proper order. I will show, 1, that nothing happens contrary to nature, but nature maintains an eternal, fixed, and immutable order, and at the same time demonstrate what should be understood by the term miracle. 2, that from miracles we cannot know about either the essence or the existence or the providence of God, but rather that all three are much better grasped from the fixed and unchangeable order of nature. 3, I will show from some examples in the Bible that by the decrees, volitions, and providence of God, Scripture itself means nothing other than the order of nature, which necessarily follows from His eternal law. 4, finally, I will discuss the method required for correctly interpreting the miracles narrated in the Bible, and what we should particularly notice in such miracle narratives. These are the chief points in the argument of this chapter, and I think that they are also very relevant to the aim of the work as a whole.
So here again, he lays it all out for you, and that's why we don't have to go through the whole chapter in detail, because this is what he's going to do. He shows you that natural law is immutable. It's an immutable, unchanging order. There is nothing that happens that is supernatural, above the natural, beyond the natural. And so he's going to kind of in some ways redefine what miracle is. And from
Is he being sarcastic in number 3?
No.
When he says follows his eternal law?
No, he's not being sarcastic. He's being very particular about what he says. And what he is saying, therefore, is also that when we see things that seem to be miraculous, they don't tell us anything about the existence or the providence or the essence of God. Notice he talks about the essence, existence, and providence. Essence meaning, what is God like? Existence meaning, is there a God? And thirdly, how does God act in the world? 3 critical questions. He says, miracles reveal nothing about this to us. And for him, those are the real questions that one must understand theologically. And therefore, anything that supposedly is a miracle doesn't help us with any of these things, unlike, he has just said, what common people suppose, that miracles are things that absolutely prove the existence of God, the providence of God, and the nature of God. In other words, the Red Sea, right? The miracle of the Red Sea. What it even says in the Bible, that at that point, all of a sudden, having seen the Egyptian dead on the side of on the shores, the Israelites believed in or had trust in God and Moses. That this for them was the proof of divine providence. And you know what? If it really was miraculous, it's a pretty damn good proof, right? You might as well rearrange the stars in the skies to say, I am really here, right? But he says that doesn't happen. Notice in the next paragraph, again, we're going to sort of skip forward from those. He in effect is saying that if we believe that that there are this kind of miraculous things as opposed to universal laws of nature. Look on the next page, page 83, where it says, if anything therefore were to happen. Suzanne, you want to keep reading from there?
Where are we?
We see number 83 in the side.
If anything therefore were to happen in nature that contradicted its universal laws, it would also necessarily contradict the decree and understanding and nature of God. Or if anyone were to assert that God does anything contrary to the laws of nature, he would at the same time be compelled to assert that God acts contrary to his own nature, than which nothing is more absurd. The same thing can also easily be shown from the fact that the power of nature is the divine power and virtue itself, and the divine power is the very essence of God. But this I am happy to leave aside for the time being.
He is saying, in effect, is that if God is nature, right? Natural law reveals to us the existence, the essence, and the providence of God. That's the philosophical implications of that. That by studying and understanding natural law, this goes back to his notion of reason being the most important way of understanding things. That will answer those questions for you. Yes, Stephen?
Does he address Maimonides' idea that all the miracles were built in?
Yeah, he does. He actually attacks Maimonides very specifically at some point. Okay? So he doesn't accept that, because nothing in his idea can have contradicted the laws of nature. So take a look at the next paragraph. Irma, you want to pick it up where it says consequently.
Consequently, nothing happens in nature that contradicts its universal laws, and nothing occurs which does not conform to those laws or follow from them. For whatever happens, happens by God's will and his eternal decree, i.e., as we have already shown, whatever happens, happens according to laws and rules which involve eternal necessity and truth.
So you see, this is why Spinoza is depicted as being fairly deterministic, which is part of this Newtonian worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Go on.
Nature, therefore, always observes laws and rules which involve eternal necessity and truth, albeit not all are known to us, and therefore also a fixed and immutable order.
In other words, even if we don't know what they are there. And part of the scientific endeavor in his day, which was so exciting, was the rapid accumulation of knowledge and understanding the natural order in a way that had not been understood before. Because the new scientific method, which was promulgated by Francis Bacon almost as, at the beginning, the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, the notion of experiment and observation. And by experiment it had to be replicated. This whole scientific method had now become quite prevalent and therefore was opening up everything, because before, in medicine, for example, well, why did something happen? You go to Galen. Well, now we're testing Galen, and we're finding that Galen's wrong, because we're actually looking at things and experimenting with things. By the way, this had been done to a certain extent in the Middle Ages, but now this became the scientific method. And it starts with astronomy and physics, and and then moves into biology, especially in the 18th century. Biology becomes incredibly, a lot of advances occur. And towards the end of the 18th century, you have the emergence of geology, and that helps us and ultimately come to evolutionary science, geology and biology. So it starts with astronomy, but then pervades through what we call all of the sciences, including medicine. Okay? Go on.
No sound reasoning convinces us that we should attribute only a limited power and virtue to nature, or believe its laws are suited to certain things only, and not to all. For, since the virtue and power of nature is the very virtue and power of God, and the laws and rules of nature are the very decrees of God, we must certainly believe that the power of nature is infinite, and its laws so broad as to extend to everything that is also conceived by the divine understanding.
Okay, and skip to the next page. And
this answers my question.
What?
What we just have been going through.
Well, I'm sorry, repeat your question again?
The question is, why did he not reject God when you said God is nature, nature's God?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so go over to the next page. Cal, do you want to pick it up in the paragraph where it says, I should in fact say, and let's just move the recording down a bit.
I could in fact say that a miracle is something whose cause cannot be explained from the principles of the natural things shown to us by the natural light of reason. But, since miracles were produced according to the capacity of the common people, who were completely ignorant of the principles of natural things, plainly the ancients took for a miracle whatever they were unable to explain in the manner the common people normally explained natural things, namely, by seeking to recall something similar which can be imagined without amazement. For the common people suppose they have satisfactorily explained something as soon as it no longer astounds them. Hence, for the ancients, and the vast majority of men down to our own time, this was the only criterion for defining what was miraculous. Clearly, many things are therefore related as miracles in the Bible, whose causes may readily be explained from the known causes of natural things, as we have already suggested in chapter 2 above, when we spoke of the incident of the sun standing still in the time of Joshua and its moving backwards in the time of Ahaz.
Okay, so this is very modern sounding, isn't it?
Very,
And that is the way in which, the modern perspective on ancient beliefs is often posed, right? That people didn't understand how the natural world works, so they ascribed it to supernatural beings and miraculous events and magic, but that science, by its ability to explain things according to natural law, has supplanted those explanations. And by the way, it's very true. That's exactly what happened. In Western societies, from the time of the Protestant Reformation through to the 20th century, the belief in magic, for example, has declined severely. The belief in demons as a cause of illness. In other words, there are so many things which before were normally considered to have a supernatural explanation have been shown to have natural explanations. Not that magical thinking has completely disappeared from our way of looking at things, but it's been severely reduced in the vast majority of westernized populations. So this is why he sounds so modern, because he is in effect part of that process which has produced a totally new perspective on the way the world works. Okay, let us skip, let's go to the next page where it says number 7, but let it be supposed. Cal, you want to keep going?
But let it be supposed that a miracle is something that cannot be explained by natural causes. This can be understood in two ways. Either it does indeed have natural causes, though they cannot be discovered by human understanding, or it admits no cause but God or the will of God.
Okay, so miracles can explain, number one, we just don't understand yet what it is, or it can have, he's saying, you can put it that it is God, right? That God actually did it. Go on.
But because all things that happen by natural causes also happen by the sole power and will of God, we must necessarily conclude, finally, that whether a miracle has natural causes or not, it is a phenomenon that cannot be explained by a cause. That is, it is a phenomenon that surpasses human understanding. But we can understand nothing of a phenomenon, or of anything at all, that surpasses our understanding.
Okay.
For
tautology.
Yeah, exactly. It's a tautology. Good way to put it, Marianne.
For whatever we understand clearly and distinctly must become known to us either by itself or by means of something else that is understood clearly and distinctly. Therefore, we cannot understand from a miracle or work which surpasses our understanding the essence of God or his existence, or anything about God and nature.
In other words, miracles, something that we don't understand or maybe can't understand, they don't tell us anything about God. Again, he is trying to counteract what he believes is the common understanding of the role of miracles for our understanding of God. Okay?
Isn't the very nature of a miracle the fact that it is incomprehensible and that you cannot understand it?
Yes, that's what he's saying. In other words,
Yes.
he's saying, but it doesn't tell us anything. It's useless.
Unless it proves to you the existence of God.
But he's saying it doesn't prove the existence of God, because if it's so incomprehensible, it doesn't teach us anything. Okay, now you might not agree with his characterization of that, because in fact, in the Bible, the word for miracle, nes, means sign. Something that points towards the divine providence, the action of God in the world. But he's rejecting all of that, okay? And what he is... so he basically is fulfilling, and then what he does in his third point, which begins on page 87, is to talk about things that show up in Scripture. And what he's trying to show is that most of what is called a miracle in Scripture, in fact, can be explained by natural law. That these stories about these events are, later are people's perception that they were miracles, but in fact, they have perfectly natural causes. Now, of course, there are some things that, well, take a look on page 90, for example. He's discussing, in the middle of the paragraph, 14, he's discussing the plagues. And he says, notice that for the Egyptians to be inflicted with boils, it was necessary for Moses to throw ashes up into the air. So the ashes were the cause of the boils, hence not supernatural. The locusts reached the land of Egypt by a natural command of God, namely by means of a wind from the east that blew for a whole day and night. Later they left it because of a strong wind from the west. And of course that's exactly what the Bible says. So he's saying there's nothing miraculous about this. It was completely natural. It was by the same command of God that the sea opened up a path for the Jews, namely because of an east wind that blew very strongly the whole night. So in effect he's saying it had a perfectly natural cause. To raise the boy who is believed to be dead, this is a story in, right, that there's a boy who supposedly died and Elisha brings him back to life. Elisha needed to lie over him for some time until he first grew warm and finally opened his eyes. And in fact, he's saying the boy really wasn't dead. People thought he was dead, and therefore it became a miracle. All right? And he is also talking here, he actually goes and talks about one of the miracles, the healing of the blind man by Jesus. So, again, time and time again, he is trying through the Bible to prove that, in effect, everything that is described, he would say, by the writers of these texts as miraculous has a perfectly good natural explanation. I think he's stretching things a little bit here. All right? If you look on page 492, paragraph 18, he begins also to, he discusses again Joshua's, the famous event in Joshua where the sun stands still, which again is one of the central texts that the opponents of Copernicus cite as how Copernicus must be incorrect if you are faithful to the Bible. That's the point. Take a look on page 93.
How did he explain how the sun allegedly stands still?
I forget exactly, but if you go back earlier, he kind of gives again a perfectly naturalistic explanation of it. Because he knows that according to the heliocentric universe, that's impossible. It's impossible. He keeps. I mean, that a large part of the rest of the book is dealing with that. Let's go to the end of the chapter. Let's look at paragraph 23. Cal, you want to keep reading there? This is on page 96. Although I say that Scripture teaches these things, however, I do not mean that the Bible promotes them as doctrines necessary for salvation, but only that the prophets embrace them just as we do. Therefore, it is up to every man to hold the opinion about them that he feels best enables him to subscribe with all his mind to the cult and religion of God. This is also the opinion of Josephus. Here is what he writes at the end of the book 2 of his Antiquities. Let no one disbelieve this talk of a miracle occurring among men of the distant past, innocent of evil as they were, for whom a path to safety opened through the sea, whether this happened by God's will or by its own accord. For in more recent times the Pamphilian Sea divided for the troops of Alexander, king of Macedon, and afforded them a passage through it when they had no other way to go, since it was God's will to destroy the Persian kingdom by means of him. This is admitted by everyone who has written about the deeds of Alexander. Everyone therefore should think as he pleases about these things. These are Josephus' words and his judgment about belief in miracles. In effect, he's ascribing to Josephus a similar belief of his. What's interesting is, of course, he's reading Josephus, which up until the Renaissance, Jews didn't know the existence of Josephus. But since the Renaissance, since the 15th century, starting in Italy, Jews began to read some of the ancient Greek authors, and they all of a sudden discovered this Jewish historian. And so Josephus knows Greek and is reading Josephus, which other educated Jews in his day would have been doing as well. Okay, so what the whole point is, he is attempting to break down our understanding of the Bible and to eliminate the category of the supernatural. This is important for him in his political agenda, because what he's trying to do is to lessen the power of the religious establishment in his day, to take away from them, from the clergy, from theologians, the power of what they are saying. He is trying to divorce philosophy from religion, and he is trying, in effect, to completely change the way people look at the Bible by rejecting the interpretive traditions of Judaism and Christianity and going back to what we would call a plain reading of the text from the text itself. All right? And if you go, for example, to, and again, one of the people that he's that lies behind a lot of what he's saying is Maimonides. on page 112, he really goes after Maimonides' interpretation of Scripture. He's done it before, but this is really where he does a very, very detailed attack on Maimonides' philosophical interpretation of Scripture, and from the Guide for the Perplexed. That, you know, Maimonides' idea is that Scripture is a philosophical text that can be understood philosophically. This was something that was generally accepted by Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It started with Philo, and Spinoza is the one who breaks this apart, takes apart this whole tradition, which is more than 1,500 years old. Okay? What he then does is essentially go through the entire Bible and does a source analysis of all of them, as well as philological analysis, manuscript difficulties. In other words, he just like takes everything apart. And he, in fact, in chapter 11, even discusses the composition of the New Testament. All right? And what's interesting is that although he often depicts Jesus in a positive light, he completely eliminates anything from the miraculous of Jesus and turns Jesus. Jesus for him is not a prophet, not a Messiah. Nothing miraculous happens with him, but he is a wise man, right? Who receives his knowledge of God directly, like a good philosopher should. So he's also completely taking away the most important doctrinal ideas of Christianity, although he's a little more careful about that. Yeah.
So if he believes that God exists as a natural world,
yeah,
how can anyone receive information from God?
By studying the natural world.
So that's not really a supernatural being imparting information.
Because there is no supernatural. There is only the universe, and the universe is God. So, by the way,
so he refers to it as God just for the sake of the eons in which people believed in a God.
No, for him the universe is God. I mean, he really is God. Okay? But yeah, there's sometimes rhetorically he's saying he's got a dual meaning to what he is saying. The idea, again, you have to understand, because this is for the educated masses, sometimes he has to be very careful of the way he talks about God. But philosophically, his God has no personality, has no gender, has, you know, in other words, it is a pure, we might even call it a force. But it's not a being. It's being itself. Yes.
I think our problem is with a lot of these people that they use words that we understand in one way, but they really use them in another way, and I think it's continually confusing and pulling you in different directions.
Yes.
Because you have a concept of a word and not using it that way.
So are you referring to the word God?
For one, yes.
You see, Rabbi, at the very beginning, you showed us that picture where he had caveat.
Yes.
And so what I'm seeing here is I think this is a man who understands he's walking on a precipice.
Of course he is.
And he's about to get his head removed from his body. And that's why he keeps referring to the word God, even though he thinks it's nonsense. But he has to do it because this is how he can talk to the people who are about to try to decapitate him.
Well, to a certain extent you're right, because after all, he saw his friend, one of his closest friends, thrown into jail and die there. He's seen religious persecutions. He lived through the 30 Years' War, okay? So, yeah, he's got to be really careful, and what happens is when he publishes this, he had a bloody good right to be careful. The way it was attacked. Somebody said this was a book forged in hell.
This was written how long after? At what age? Because at 24 he was excommunicated.
Yeah, this is years after he was excommunicated.
The way I read this is he's almost trying to say, I'm attacking, but I'm talking your language, and please don't kill me.
Well, yeah, but I mean, he's still saying pretty radical stuff.
Oh,
I mean,
no, yeah.
The point is, what I want you to understand, Robert, though, he's not an atheist the way we understand atheism. Okay? He's not just an atheist trying to hide under theistic language. He is truly, as somebody referred to him later on, a God-intoxicated person. He really is deeply spiritual, even mystical, but it's not theistic. It's not about God as a being, but God as being itself. Which, by the way, the deists in the 18th century were essentially the same. One could look at Mordecai Kaplan in the 20th century as essentially believing the same thing. Spinoza, when the Jewish community, in the modern Jewish, a lot of people, Jews in the 20th century, read Spinoza in various translations and were heavily influenced by his thought. I was just reading something about a very famous writer and poet named Hillel Zeitlin, who was killed during the Holocaust, who was in his youth, came up from a Hasidic background, who then was exposed to modernity. I'm going to talk more about this next week, but the impact of Spinoza on modern Jewish ideas is quite considerable. Okay? But do not think he is an atheist the way we understand atheism. He was charged by that, and he vehemently denied that. He is, however, non-theistic. He doesn't believe in the classical theistic notion of God. So when we hear, I think it was Suzanne, I think she's absolutely correct. When we hear the word God, we immediately think of a theistic idea of God as a being. Maybe not an old guy living in the sky, but somehow this being who is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, and is existing beyond the universe. That he is rejecting. And to a certain extent he is being careful, but on the other hand, he's not being so careful. I mean, his attack on the Bible, or his understanding of the Bible is incredibly radical. And he didn't hold back.
You know, I read part of his discussion of the word ruach.
Yeah, ruach, yeah.
Ruach. And he works it and works it and works it. Mm-hmm. And it means this in this chapter, in this place in the Torah it means this, in this place it means that, and he goes through all these different meanings, and you just, as you're reading it, you just feel, you feel the hand of man writing this word. This kind of interpretation of a word just makes you feel how man was involved in writing this.
Yes.
And it's incredibly effective, I thought.
And for many people, once you begin to break down what it was considered to be revelation into a human written document, this for them destroys their religious faith. That's why they thought he was so dangerous. He is in effect saying, yeah, it destroys the old ideas about God, but that doesn't mean there isn't a God. And what is he trying to get out of this? He's trying to create what we would call a universal religion that all people of faith can subscribe to and therefore have tolerance for others. And go to page 182. Here is where he very distinctly lists what he thinks are the characteristics of universal religion that every person of faith, whatever they believe about God, can ascribe to. We're on page 182. Harvey, I think it's your turn.
Number 10?
Well, you don't have to read number 10. Skip to his list. Number 1, there is.
There is a God. There is a God that is a supreme being who is supremely just and merciful, or an exemplar of the true life, whom no one who does not know or who does not believe that he exists can obey or acknowledge as judge. He is one, for no one can doubt that this too is absolutely required for supreme devotion, admiration, and love towards God. Devotion, admiration, and love will arise only from the preeminence of one above all others. He is everywhere present and all things are manifest to him. For if things were believed to be hidden from him, or if it were not known that he sees all things, there would be doubts about the equity of his justice, by which he directs all things, or it would even be unknown. He possesses supreme right and dominion over all things, nor is it anything that he does compelled by laws, but he does all things at his absolute pleasure and by his unique grace. For all men are obliged to obey him, absolutely, but he is obliged to obey no one.
5. Go ahead.
Worship of God and obedience to him consists solely in justice and charity, or in love of one's neighbor.
Now, he's using theistic language here, you notice. Okay? He is using theistic language. But his God is not a theistic God. And notice number 5. What does it mean? All rituals, prayer, everything else, they're really not necessary. The way in which we worship the God most is in justice, charity, and love of one's nature.
It's almost like Micah.
Well, he is to some extent, but he is saying this is the universal, this is what all religions can agree with. In his case, he really means just Judaism and Christianity and all the various sects of Christianity. That's the basic, that for him is universal religion. Read on, number 6, all who obey God.
All who obey God in this rationale of living, and only they are saved. Those who live under the sway of pleasures are lost. If people did not firmly believe this, there would be no reason why they should obey God, rather than their own pleasures.
And what he means by saved is not the traditional Christian way of understanding saved. He doesn't believe in hell, right? Go on, last paragraph.
Finally, God forgives the repentant their sins, for there is no one who does not sin. And therefore, if this were not clearly established, all would despair of their salvation. It's interesting, he talks about salvation.
Yeah, again, he's using Christian language here, and theistic language.
And would have no reason to believe that God is merciful. But anyone who firmly believes that God forgives men's sins with the mercy and grace with which he directs all things, and is more fully inspired with the love of God for this reason, truly knows Christ according to the Spirit, and Christ within him.
Again, for him, Jesus is not a supernatural Messiah. But again, he is using language here that is very Christian, very theistic, and this is for rhetorical reasons. Because everything he has said about the Bible, about Revelation, is towards a completely radical, non-theistic God. So this dual meaning of his language, which, by the way, the scholar Yovel, who wrote that 2-volume work called Spinoza and Other Heretics, believes is a characteristic of Marano rhetoric, dual meaning. You say one thing, but you really mean something else. All right?
So are you saying that we should take all of these and say that we should really believe or think he is advocating the opposite?
No, he's not advocating the opposite. But if you really look at what he's saying, on the surface, he's using conventional language, but the radical nature of what he's saying is really there. Okay? You have to understand, he's using certain rhetorical devices. Yes, Sam?
He refers a lot to Jesus. Does he refer, as far as you know, to Muhammad?
Yeah, he very rarely, and usually refers to it as the Turks, as opposed to them. He doesn't really know Islam, and he's, as a typical European, he's rather disparaging, because you have to understand the Ottoman Empire was still, although it was in decline, was still a significant threat to Europe. I mean, it controlled large parts of the Balkans. So, you know, the Ottomans in the 16th century had almost broken, I mean, they laid siege to Vienna, and if they had, you know, captured Vienna, would have basically moved into most of Central Europe. They tried it again in the 17th century, were beaten back. So the Ottomans are in retreat at this point. The West is now beginning to really, for a whole variety of reasons, become, lessen the power of the Ottomans, but they are still perceived as a significant threat in Europe. So as a typical European, he does not really he doesn't know much about Islam, and he sees them as, the enemy, essentially. Yes, Stephen, you had a question.
Would we understand what he's saying about Jesus better if we thought of him as Buddha?
That's a good question. Buddha, that's a pretty good idea, yeah. Maybe not even quite as Buddha. For him, Jesus was a very wise man, but nothing supernatural about him, no miracles, no prophecy, no Messiah. I mean, it's pretty, he uses the term Christ, I think, again, as a rhetorical device, and he does say Jesus sometimes, but by using the term Christ, which has such connotations for reading Christians, he, again, is trying to lessen a little bit, I think without success, by the way, lessening a little bit about the anxiety of his readers as to what he is saying about religion.
Who was that author who referred to this as Marano-type rhetoric?
Yovel, who wrote a 2-volume work, which I've mentioned earlier, called Spinoza and Other Heretics. The first volume is about Spinoza, and he sees Spinoza, he interprets all of Spinoza's thinking as coming out of what he calls a Marano culture. The second volume is all of the later philosophers who, in effect, continued the work of Spinoza and the impact of Spinoza on people like Hegel and Nietzsche and a whole bunch of modern modern philosophers. Yes.
Would you say, I'm troubled by his use of the word saved, and I want to know what he means. And to me, is it like I think it's Maimonides who says that the more you study, the more you understand. You will behave rightly.
Yeah.
As opposed to letting your emotions
exactly.
have sway, and that
Absolutely.
is essentially salvation.
Yeah, in a certain sense, you're freeing yourself from your passions that can get you into trouble. So you may be right. That's what he may mean by that.
Because I can't see that he means. What can he mean in terms of all the things he's
right.
been saying?
Exactly. He's not meaning it in its traditional Christian context. Yes.
Or Jewish.
I can sort of reconcile these statements with Spinoza's theology by substituting God of nature for God in each instance. But what I can't do is in the first paragraph, because the attributes are so human and very Jewish, just and merciful.
And Christian, by the way.
Yeah. Just and merciful are human attributes, and I don't see what they're doing there. It's very consistent.
Again, it's rhetoric. It's a rhetorical device. Because ultimately his God is a pure, is nature and doesn't act in the world in those ways. Okay?
Right.
So where's mercy?
That's why
So where's what?
I have a problem.
Where is mercy then?
Yeah,
I mean,
there's no mercy in nature.
These are all good points, by the way. I mean, when you really get down to it, what he says about the true nature of worship, for him, the study of nature through reason, through what we would call scientific analysis, leads to the apprehension of how God himself and how God works in the world, and what is important for human society. What does he say? Justice, mercy, acts of charity, love of nature. That's it. Okay? Now.
But the very first thing he said, number one, there is a God that is a supreme being. I mean, that's really quite different from what.
Yes, you're right. And he's really, again, you have to see this as a rhetorical device, because for him, God is not a being. God is being itself.
Okay. I've always had this. Reading this, coming into it, having missed 2 lectures, I think
have you caught up online?
I tried, Rabbi, but I'm a lazy person.
Yes.
One of the things that I feel is I don't understand what he's saying in the same way I don't understand Josephus. Josephus has these alternating things of pure historian, and then he's a sycophant to the emperor, and then pure history, and then a sycophant.
Because that's what history was in those days.
But what I'm saying is, reading this, I'm starting to get the same feeling, that there's some of the things that he's saying that he just doesn't mean. Now, it could be that this is, I don't want him to mean what he's saying, and you sort of pushing it aside by saying it's rhetoric. So
I'm not pushing it aside. I think there's a very intentional, I mean, if you look at for example, the introduction to this book by the person who translated it, he discusses his rhetoric, his method and his rhetoric. It's really important. I mean, for example, he talks about on Roman numeral 8:17, detaching Christ from the churches. Okay, he talks about on page Roman numeral X, Spinoza's method. Right, and then it talks about his theory of tolerance, which I think is we're going to, I was hoping to get into today. But the point is, he has a method, and his rhetoric is part of his method to break down certain ideas.
Getting back to the question of mercy in the natural world, perhaps the ability to survive is merciful.
Maybe. We're going to have to end here. I was really hoping to get into the political part, which starts with chapter 16. And I hope that what I want to do next week is really to do the political, but leave time for the end of his life, because I intentionally, we stopped talking about his life up to in the first session and a half, up to the point where he publishes this book. So I want to tell you about what happened afterwards, and also his impact on later thought, including later Jewish thought. But in preparation, if you want to start reading from chapter 16, this is where he really begins to get into the political implications of what he is doing. Chapter 17, he talks about the Hebrew state and Moses. You can skip that if you want, and also 18. But 19 is where he gets back very specifically. I mean, he's using Moses and the Israel state as a model, at least the early Israel state, before the monarchy, as a model of what society is. His interpretation of the tribal confederacy, he reinterprets as a republic, not unlike the republic he's living in. That's the interesting, I mean, we'll look at parts of it, but he in his last two chapters, he's really calling for the notion of a republican form of politics based upon his theology. What?
Small r.
Small r, yes, small r. Because the Netherlands was a republic. It was not a monarchy at the time, although eventually it would become a constitutional monarchy, not in his day. And that was one of the things I told you about, that there was a big fight going on between those who were leaning towards a more monarchical form of governments and those who were republican. And in his own day, the monarchical people, to a certain extent, had gained the ascendancy right around before he published this book, and they were backed by the strict Calvinist fundamentalists, which is why his friend ended up in prison. So there is a major political fight going on. I'll tell you about how one of the most important Republican politicians at the time was basically murdered by a mob, and it was all wrapped up also in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and he is in the middle of a very critical fight going on over the nature of the Republic of the Netherlands. And he's trying to help the forces that are leaning towards Republican government, which allowed for freedom of thought, but insisted also upon laws to create order, which meant for him, as you will see, the fact that the state was allowed to regulate religion. Okay? Regulate religion, regulate behavior. He's not where the United States came to at the end of the 18th century. He's not there. But there's many things that he says